Hi, welcome to Challenge JP. My name is Jacek, and today I'm going to show you how to create a consolidated P&L dashboard in Microsoft Power BI.
Before we get into the details on how to create a dashboard, let's look at the complete Power BI file. As you can see, the dashboard consists of 4 report pages. The first page, Actuals, consolidates P&L from 4 different subsidiaries. So here we can select whether we want to analyze all of the subsidiaries together or look at them separately. The second page is an analysis. So here again we have our monthly P&L, but this time we want to see how the revenue, COGS, profit, OPEX, and then operating profit changes on a monthly basis. So as you can see here, I've added a column with values that show that month-on-month variance. In addition to that, I've also added matrix that breaks down the revenue by client and subsidiary, so you can see how each country contributes to the overall client revenues. And then I've also added a similar matrix, but this time with annual gross profit. Another report page, Dashboard, visualizes our profit and loss numbers. So for example, here you can see how the revenue, COGS, OPEX, operating profit, and then the revenue changes on a monthly basis. Here we have our annual breakdown by the subsidiaries. Below that, using that trim up graph, you can see our top 5 clients by revenue. And then here in this graph, you can also see clients, but this time rank by the lowest gross profit. Finally, our forecast page allows you to create projections for the next year using the actuals as our basis. So here we will apply Power BI parameters that will act as our forecast drivers, and that will allow you to change the revenues, COGS, exchange rate, OPEX on a year-to-year basis. Throughout this course, I will be referring to my web tutorial, and you can find a link to this web page in the description of this video. And as you can see from the table of contents, I will start with loading and transforming the data, adding some mapping tables, creating relationships, and eventually creating a data model. Then I will proceed to build that consolidated monthly profit and loss dashboard using DAX measures and Power BI visuals, which will form the basis of our forecast using those Power BI parameters that I've just mentioned. As you can see, here we can also preview the dashboard or download the entire Power BI file along with the DAX measures and the data sources. So let's start with that step 1, which deals with loading and transforming the data in Microsoft Power BI. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I will be using 6 data sets, 4 fact files, which include transactions from each subsidiary, then the table with the exchange rates, and then a table that will allow us to map local codes to global codes in order to create consistency across our reports. So first I'm going to start with a blank page, which I will call simply our practice sheet. And here I'll show you how to load those data and create data model and then create first DAX measures. And in order to load the first data, I'll simply go to the Home tab, click on the Get Data icon, select text CSV, go to my data folder, and then I will select that fact DE file, click on Open. And then for now, I'm just going to click on Load. And then once I've loaded those 4 files with the data from the subsidiaries, we'll click on the Transform Data to open a Power Query editor and apply our first data transformation. So for now, I'm going to go back to my Get Data icon, click on Text CSV, and then I'm going to load another one, so fact JP, just the data from Japan. Click on Load, then again Get Data, Text CSV, and then I'll load the data from UK, open, and then load again, and then again click Get Data, Text CSV, and then select our US data, click on Open, and then I will click on Load. Okay, and now with those 4 data sets loaded, I will go to the Transform Data icon, and then click on the Transform Data, which will open our Power Query editor. So first of all, here you can use that editor to inspect the data. You will see that the data sets contain transaction date, the name of the subsidiary, local account code, client name, the amount in the local currency, and the currency used in the report. So for example, here, DE Germany uses euro as a currency, Japan would be yen, UK would be pounds, and then the US would be USD. So our first task is to consolidate those data into one table. And to do that, I'm going to stay on my Home tab, go to Append Queries, click on that arrow here, and then select Append Queries as new. And here in my window, I want to select an option which tells the Power Query that I want to concatenate 3 or more tables. So here I want to select all of our tables. You see that the US is already in that tables to append box. So we just want to add our German, Japanese, and then the UK data. And then once we're happy with the selection here, with that tables to append box, we can click OK. You can see to the left that that created a new table called append 1. So let's first rename it to data consolidated. Okay, and then if we click on that filter next to subsidiary, and I'll click on that load more option, you'll see that that table contains the data from all the subsidiaries. So that's our first step in consolidating the data. Now, let's click on that close and apply option, and you can see our 5 tables now with that data pane to the right. So let's bring in 2 more tables. So again, get data, text CSV, and then FX rates. Click on open. So let's click on the transform data just to very quickly inspect it in Power Query Editor. Okay, and what you can see here is that we have our currency exchange from a local currency to a dollar. And for simplicity, we assume that as a date, we take the last day of the actual year. So in our case, this is the 31st of December 2024. And in a few moments, we'll create a calculation that allows us to convert our local currency to the reporting currency, which in our case is USD. Let's click on close and apply. I can see that FX rates table also in our data pane. And now let's go again to a get data, click on text CSV, and then I'm just going to select that map accounts table. And this is a table that allows us to take local account codes from a given subsidiary and then map them to our common or global account code that we will apply across our consolidated reporting. So we'll use that table later in our calculations, but for now, let's click on close and apply, and then load it in our Power BI file. So you can see that that table map accounts is also added to a data pane. And now let's switch from the report view to our model view. And here you can see each of our tables represented by a rectangle. So our next task is to create links between those tables. But first, let's order them a little bit to make it easier. So I'm going to move our individual fact table to the right and actually collapse them. Then I'm going to move our data consolidated table somewhere here below. Let's move our mapping table here to the left, and then FX rates here. Okay, and then before I start making the links, I need to add one more DAX table and then also a column to our mapping table. So first of all, let's add a new table, which we'll call our calendar table. And that's an important one because we want to put our data on the timeline. So if we go back to my tutorial, you will see here that in the step 2, I added a code for a calendar table. So that's going to be that DAX table that I mentioned before. And this table allows us to create a calendar with the minimum and maximum date based on our data consolidated table. In addition to that, we want to add one more full year to accommodate next year's forecast, and then add some columns like year or month number or quarter that we can use in our future DAX calculations. So I'm just going to copy that code, go back to my practice sheet, and then while I'm in that model view, I'm going to stay in the Home tab and click on the new table, and then I'm going to paste in that code and then hit enter. You can see now we have another rectangle with that calendar table. So let's just move it to the left. You can expand it a little bit. And now if we go back again to my web tutorial and I scroll down a little bit, you will see here that in our data consolidated table, we want to create additional column, which we will call a local key. So I'm going to go back to my practice sheet, click transform data, again, select the data consolidated, then add column tab, and then select that custom column. I'm going to call this column a local key. And for the values, I want to display subsidiary with a dash in between, and then the local account code transforming the value to a text. So I'm going to use that subsidiary and dash and text from local code formula, which you can simply copy from the web tutorial. If I click OK, you will see that that creates this another column, again, local key, which has a value from the subsidiary column here, and then local account code with a dash in between. Now we want to repeat the same step for our map accounts table. So again, I'll click on add column, custom column, and then again, call the new column local key. And then here I can also use the same formula. So I'll take the subsidiary, add dash in between them, and then I'll take the local account code and make sure it's in a text format, then click OK. And you see here to the right, I have that column which will now allow me to create a link between these map accounts and data consolidated tables. So let's go to the Home tab, click on Close and Apply, and then you can see the local key in here in the map accounts, and then also local key in the data consolidated table. So let's actually grab that local key field from the map accounts table and then drop it over local key in the data consolidated. And then here we want to make sure that the relationship flows from the map accounts table to the data consolidated. So the cardinality is one to many, the cross filter direction is single, and then the relationship is active. Let's click on Save, and you see that first connection here. Now, with the FX rates, we want to connect the currency field from the FX rates table to the currency field in the data consolidated table. So again, I'm going to drag and drop it over the appropriate field. And then again, our relationship is one to many. So FX rates to data consolidated, cross filter direction is single, and then the relationship is active. Let's click on Save. And then for the calendar, before we create a relationship, let's click on the three dots here and then make sure we select Mark as Date Table, then switch it on and then choose column Date as our date column. Then click on Save. And then after we've done that, I can take the date field from the calendar table and then drop it over transaction date. Okay, so those would be the corresponding field in the data consolidated table. Again, the relationship from the calendar to the data consolidated is one to many, single, and active. Let's click on Save. And that completes our base data model. Now, if you go back to our web tutorial, you can review your data model and make sure those relationships are correct. Now, if we scroll down, you can see that we can go to the step 3 and then start building our consolidated monthly profit and loss. Before we do that, there's one more step that we have to apply, which is converting the local currency to our reporting currency, which in our case is US dollar. So with our connections in place, we can go back to our practice sheet, then click on the table view, and then select data consolidated. So we want to add here two columns. One is the FX rate that will apply to our local currency, and then the reporting amount, which will be equivalent in US dollars. So here, make sure you're in the table tools and then select new column. And this allows us to add our first DAX column. So I'm going to name this column FX rate and then select that related FX rate reporting function, which goes to the FX rates table and then selects appropriate FX rate based on the currency. So let's hit enter. So here you see we have a 1 as an FX rate because that's a US subsidiary, so the exchange is 1-to-1. But if we scroll here, for example, to our German subsidiary, you will see that FX rate is 109, which reflects that exchange rate from that FX rates table. Now, we want to add additional column. So let's go back to my web tutorial. And then you can see here that in order to create that amount reporting column, we simply have to take that amount local and then multiply it by that FX rate. All of those values now come from the data consolidated table. So let's go back to my practice sheet. Again, click on the new column, and then we can type in the function or just copy and paste it, then hit enter, which then shows you that amount reporting with the values that result of multiplying the local currency by the FX rate. So again, if we scroll down a little bit, we see here we have our Japanese subsidiary. So that's the local currency in yen. That's the FX rate. So if we multiply one by another, the result is the value which you can see in that amount reporting column. So now with that step completed, we can start creating our consolidated profit and loss across our subsidiaries and create our first DAX measures. Before we create our first DAX measure, let's go back to report view. And then here, I'm going to select that enter data icon, which will allow me to create a new table. Now I'm going to call this table measures table and then click on load. And here we can see it appearing in our data pane. This table will be a repository for our DAX measures, which will allow us to keep them in one place. So in order to create my first DAX measure, I'm going to right click on that measures table and then select new measure. And now I can go back to my web tutorial. And then here below our first columns, you will see that I have a measure, one called amount reporting, which simply sums the values from the amount reporting column in the data consolidated table. And then another measure, also amount reporting, but this time signed, which applies negative numbers for cost and then keeps the revenues as positives. So the first measure is a simpler one. I'm simply going to copy it go back to my practice sheet and then paste it in, then hit enter or click commit here. And you see that measures appearing in our measures table. Right click on that column 1 field and then delete it from model. And you see that measures table move to the top. The icon has changed to indicate calculations. Again, let's go back to the web tutorial, and here we'll take that amount reporting sign measure. So this measure uses the SUMX function, which means it iterates from that data consolidated amount reporting column, and then it multiplies it by the related value in the PL sign column, which is 1 or -1. So if it's a cost, it's going to multiply it by -1. If it's revenue, it's going to multiply it by 1, effectively making the cost negative and the revenues positive numbers. So I'm going to copy that, go back to my practice sheet. Again, right click on the measures table, click on the new measure, then paste it in, enter. You can also see appearing it in our measures table. Then again, go back to the web tutorial. And then this time I'm going to copy that actual amount measure, which simply look at the sign amounts, but only from our actual period, using that is actual column from the calendar table, which we created just a few moments ago. So again, I'm going to copy that, go back to my practice sheet, right click on the measures table, select new measure, paste it, and enter. And now with our tables and just those 3 measures in place, we can create our first visual. So let's go to the Insert tab, then open that visual gallery, and then select Matrix. Now in my rows, I'm going to select year month for my calendar table. Then for my columns, I'm going to select that common category field for my map accounts table. And then for my values, I'm going to choose that actual amount measure, which is the measure that we just created. So you see here, I have my first very basic profit and loss consolidation. Now I want to click on that actual amount again. And then when I'm in the measures tool, I can click on that $sign to format my measure. And then I'll select 0 as the number of decimal points. And let's go to my complete dashboard with monthly actuals and then the annual breakdown of the P&L by the subsidiary. So my first visual here is also a matrix. And then here, if you look at the setup of the matrix, you see that in the rows, I also insert that year month field from the calendar table. But then for my values, I inserted the relevant DAX measures. And you can see those measures here to the right in my measures table. You will see that I've also added 2 folders. One is called actuals, the other one is called forecast. And then you can create this folder by going to the model view. And then here, if you click on one of the measures, so for example, a revenue actual, and then if you go to the properties tab, you should see that display folder field. So all you have to do is just type in the name of the folder where you want to place your measure. And if the folder doesn't exist yet, it will create that new folder, or it will insert this measure to already an existing folder. And then if you go to the report view, if you want to create a new measure, rather than right clicking on the measures table, you just have to right click on the folder name and then also click new measure. So let's go back to our matrix. And then let's look at the first measure, which is our revenue actual here. And then what you will see here in the measure is that we're going to be using that amount report sign measure that we just created a few moments ago. Again, this is the measure that goes to our data consolidated table and then sums up the values from the amount column. And then in addition to that, it makes the cost negative, and then it keeps revenues as positive numbers. So we're using that amount reporting sign as our base here. But you see that that's measures inside of the calculate function because we want to make sure that we apply a filter. So we only want to look at the amounts that are related to the actual periods, look in our calendar table. And also in this case, we want to make sure that the values are attributed to revenues only. So this is where we use that filter for map accounts, common category equals revenue. Now, if you look at the COGS, you see that here in this measure, we also use the calculate function. Again, we look at the amount report signed measure. We only want to look at the actuals. And then as a common category filter, we use COGS. Now for the gross profit, we simply take the revenue actual plus COGS actual. We're adding COGS because it's a negative number. So effectively, we'll be subtracting that value from our revenues. And then for the gross profit percentage here, I'm using that gross profit margin actual percentage measure, which simply divides the gross profit actual by the revenue actual. Now for our OPEX, again, I'm using that calculate function, take that amount reporting sign as my base, make sure I only apply that calculation to my actuals, and then make sure that I only show my values for OPEX only using that map accounts common category column as my filter. Now my operating profit, I simply take the gross profit and I adjust it for my OPEX actual. Again, I'm using positive number because OPEX is negative. So effectively, we're deducting that OPEX from my gross profit. And then for the operating profit percentage, I'm using that operating profit margin percentage actual measure, which divides that operating profit by the revenue. Similarly to what we did with our initial matrix on our practice sheet, we want to make sure that we format those measures. So for example, all those operating profit margin measures should be formatted as a percentage here. And then we display the values with dollar signs, which is the reporting currency that we use in our report. Now, you see that here we're also using that subsidiary slicer, which allows us to limit our analysis to a specific subsidiary. So for example, here we use the slicer to show the numbers just for Germany, Japan, UK, US. We can also combine a few subsidiaries together. Now, in order to make that subsidiary slicer work, we have to go back to our model view and then add one more DAX table. So first, if we go back to my web tutorial, and again, you can find the link to this page in the description of this video, you will see that in the step 4, I've listed the measures that we just discussed. And then in my step 4b, we have a measure for our subsidiary DAX table. So let's just copy that measure. And then we go back to my dashboard and then click on the model view. You see that here, in addition to our initial 4 tables, we also have the subsidiary table and also the clients. If I click on that subsidiary table, you'll see that measure that I've just copied from my web tutorial. And you can create this table simply by going to a new table and typing in or pasting that measure in. And what this measure does, it simply goes to the data consolidated subsidiary column. And based on that column, it creates another table with unique values for the subsidiaries. Effectively, if I go to my table view, you see that it creates that table with one column called subsidiary and then DE, JP, UK, US as the values, which represent each country. Also in the model view, you see that clients table. So here we're using the similar approach. We're also using that values function, but this time we want to go to data consolidated and create a small table with unique client names. And then here you see that we have a one-to-many relationship between subsidiary table and the subsidiary column in our data consolidated table, and then the client name column from this clients table and the client name field in the data consolidated table as well. So here, if we go to the report view, you see that now I can insert a slicer, which I did by going to my visual gallery in the insert tab and then selecting that slicer option here. And then if you look at the setup of the slicer, it simply uses that subsidiary column from the subsidiary table as the field. And then thanks to that relationship that we've just seen in our data model, we can filter or limit our P&L to a specific subsidiary. And then here in the second matrix, you see that as the values, I'm using the same measures that we use for that monthly P&L. But then for my rows, I'm using that subsidiary column from the subsidiary table. So again, that allows us to slice the data accordingly. And then you see here that I've added also that slicer for year by using year column from the calendar table, which is also one of the DAX tables that we created earlier. Now, with this basic P&L in place, we can go to our analysis page. And then here you see that I've expanded our matrix further. So let's click on that monthly P&L matrix first. And then in the setup, you see that I've added those month-on-month percentage measures. So looking at that month-on-month revenue measure, you see that it uses that revenue actual measure, which is simply the revenue from the current month. And then it subtracts from it the previous revenue actual measure, which is also the revenue actual measure, but taken from a month earlier. So in order for that measure to show me that previous month revenue, I have to use that calculate function again, take the revenue actual, but then I have to add that date add function by using that calendar date, -1 and month. Okay, so with that previous revenue in place, we can calculate the difference between the current revenue and the previous month revenue using that revenue month on month delta actual measure. And then with this measure in place, I can now calculate the month on month percentage change in our revenue simply by dividing that revenue month on month delta measure by the previous month's revenue using the measures that we've just looked at. And now repeat the same step for our COGS. So for my COGS month on month, I've also have to create those previous COGS and then the delta measures. Similarly for the gross profit, here I had to use that abs or absolute function to make sure that the signs are correct. My OPEX month-of-month percentage measure follows the same structure as my revenue and COGS. And then the operating profit month-of-month percentage measure has a similar structure to my gross profit by assigning that previous operating profit and then the current operating profit to the variables, then calculating the delta, and then returning the division between that delta and the absolute from the previous operating profit. Again, we're using that absolute value to make sure that we're returning the correct signs. In addition to that, you can see that for those month-on-month percentage measures, I'm using conditional formatting. So any number that has a positive impact on the P&L is shown as green, and then any value with the negative effect is shown as red. And you can apply that conditional formatting by clicking on the matrix, going to the format pane, and then selecting that cell elements section. And then if we scroll down here, you have to choose the values that you want to apply this conditional formatting to. So let's say we'll select revenue month-on-month percentage. And then if you switch on the font color and then click on that FX icon, you then have to select rules as the format style, apply to values, base it on the revenue month-on-month percentage. And then here you select your rules. So in this case, anything is positive, greater than 0 will be green. And then here, anything is less than 0 will be red. And then in the case of cost, I reverse that rule. So any number that is positive is actually red and the negative number is green because the increasing costs have negative impact on our P&L. You also see that here I'm also using that subsidiary slicer and the year slicer, which we use in our actuals page. And then in addition to that, I also have a breakdown of the revenues by client. So here I'm going to utilize that client name from that clients table that we created a few moments ago. And I'm going to place those values in the rows. Then I'm going to insert subsidiary in my columns. And then for my values, I'm going to use that actual amount measure, which was one of the first measures that we created. But in order to limit those values just to the revenues, I will use my filters pane. And here we have to make sure that we add that common category from the maps account table as the filter. And then we want to select the basic filtering and then revenue only as the value. Similarly, if I click on that matrix to the right, you will see that here I'm also using client name in the rows and then subsidiary in the columns. And I also kept the actual amount as the values. But here you see that if I go to the filter, I'm also using that common category column from the map accounts. But this time I'm selecting revenue and COGS as my values, because by adding those two values together, I can calculate my gross profit. Okay, so now let's go to our another page, which I call dashboard. And then here we can visualize our numbers. So the first chart is a line and cluster column chart. And then here I'm using that year month from the calendar table as my x-axis. Then that actual amount measure as my column y-axis. And then as my column legend, I'm using that common category column from the map accounts table, which allows me then to split that actual amount into revenue, COGS, and OPEX. In addition to that, as my line y-axis, I'm using that operating profit measure. So that's one of the measures we created earlier. And also I want to show my revenue using a 3-month moving average as my basis. So in order to do that, I'm using that moving revenue measure, which by using that dates in period function, it looks at the revenues from the last 3 months, sums them up, and then it divides it by the number of months in our time frame, which in our case will be 3, and then it returns the value as that 3-month moving average. Now my next visual is a classic column chart, and here I'm using the subsidiary from our subsidiary table as my x-axis, the actual amount measure as my y-axis, and then again I'm using that common category column from the map accounts as my legend, so we can split that actual amount into revenue, COGS, and OPEX. Now, one thing that you will notice is that here I can also select the subsidiary that I want to analyze. But as I'm selecting those different subsidiaries, those 3 graphs adjust accordingly. But this graph here, all subsidiaries stay the same. And I did it so we can use it as our benchmark. And in order to disconnect that subsidiary slicer from this graph, I had to select the slicer, go to the Format tab, and then click on that Edit Interactions icon. And then you will see those icons in the upper right corner of each visual. And those icons give you 2 options. One is called Filter and one is called None. So you see those 3 charts have Filter as the selection, here, here, and here. By that old subsidiaries chart has a None as a selection. So all you have to do in order to disconnect that slicer from this chart is to select None. and that way the selection from the slicer, in our case the subsidiaries, will not have an effect on that particular chart. So let's very quickly look at another chart here. This chart is a tree map, and here for a category I'm using the client name. Again, I'm using that actual amount as a value, and in addition to that I have to go to my filters pane, and then as my client name filter I want to make sure that I select top N as my filter type, and then I only want to show top 5 items because we only want to show here top 5 clients by revenue, and then by value I have to select revenue actual, or I have to drag and drop that revenue actual measure as the field selection. In addition to that, just as was the case with client matrix in the analysis page, we want to use that common category column from the map accounts as the filter and select revenue only as the basic filter to make sure we're only showing the revenues here. Now our last graph is that cluster bar chart, and then here we want to show the client name as the y-axis. So again, we're using that client name column from the clients table. We again want to use that actual amount as the x-axis, but this time we want to show the bottom 5 clients by gross profit, so you can interpret it as the worst performing clients. And in here I have to again use that top and filter type, but this time select bottom, not top, as my show items value. Keep it at 5. And then for the by value field, I had to drag and drop gross profit measure. And then with this analysis in place, you can now switch between the different subsidiaries, analyze the overall P&L contribution of each subsidiaries, and then identify the best or worst performers. We are now ready to move on to our forecast, where we can use the parameters to test our assumptions and see their impact on the future P&L. Before introducing our first forecast DAX measure, let's look at how to create a Power BI parameter, which will be one of the drivers behind our projections. So I'm going to go back to my practice sheet. I'm in the report view, and let me show you how to create that year-on-year revenue change percentage parameter. So what we want to do, we want to go to the modeling tab and then click on that new parameter and then select numeric range. And for the name, let's type in year-on-year revenue change percentage. Now for the data type, I'm going to select decimals because we'll be dealing with percentages. For my minimum value, I'm going to select -1, and then for the maximum, I'm going to type in 1. So those are the values that will be limiting the range of my parameter, effectively in our case here, allowing the values of -100% to 100%. And then for the increment, I'm going to type in 0.01, effectively allowing to change my parameter value by 1%. And then for the default, I'm going to select 0. So if there was no selection made, that would be our default value. I'm going to unselect that add slicer to this page box because I will add it manually in a few moments. Then let's click on create. And now you should see that parameter appearing to the right in our data pane. Now, in order for me to add the parameter to my dashboard, I have to go to the Insert tab, select my visual gallery, and then choose Slicer. And then for the Add Data, I'm going to select my parameter here and specifically that year-on-year revenue change percentage. And now we can see that as I'm moving my slider to the right, the values change from -1 towards 1 with the increment of 0.01 following our setup. I can change the size a little bit, and let's click again on our parameter field. And then I'm going to change the formatting to a percentage and then maybe change the decimal point to 1. So this will be the basis for our forecast calculation. Now, if we go back to my dashboard, you will see that here I'm using 4 parameters. So first parameter will drive the revenue adjustment on a year-to-year basis. Second parameters will look at the cost of goods sold. Then we have an OPEX assumption. And finally, that's the exchange rate adjustment, which determines our assumption around dollar appreciation or depreciation in the following year. And here we have our monthly P&L. Just as a reminder, 2024 was our actual year, and then 2025 calculations, those monthly calculations use those 2024 numbers as the basis of the forecast. Same thing here with our graph that shows the revenue, COGS, OPEX, operating profit, and that revenue moving average. And then here we will have an annual comparison between the revenue, costs, and operating profit, looking at the actuals again, which is 2024, and forecasts, which in our case is our year 2025. As always, you can follow all the measures and setup in my web tutorial. And again, you will find a link to this web page in the description of this video. So let's go back to my dashboard and then look at the setup of that matrix. So in my rows, similarly to our P&L for actuals, I'm using that year-month column from the calendar table. And then for my values, I'm going to use my forecast measures. So here you'll see that I created a folder called forecast, which I placed in that measures table. And my first measure is revenue. So first of all, this measure assigns variables to our drivers. The first driver is our year-on-year revenue change. So that's that driver that we created earlier. And then the second variable is that value from that FX driver, which will also impact the revenues for all of the non-US subsidiaries. So this measure uses that DAX calculate function combined with some X in order to calculate those future revenues. It uses that revenue PY actual measure as the basis. And you can see that this measure returns the revenue actual value for the same month using that date at function, calendar date, and then the -1 and year as the interval. So then if we go back to our revenue forecast calculation, you see that it applies our revenue growth parameter to that actual revenue, and then also any FX adjustment for the non-US subsidiary. So you see that at the moment, my parameter revenue is set at 0%. So the revenues for 2025 will equal my revenues for 2024. But let's say if I change the revenue by 35%, you will see that those revenues increase also by 35%, and the numbers here have changed. Now, in addition to that, if I, for example, assume that the dollar is 5% weaker than it was in my actual year, you'll see a further increase in revenues because we're looking here at the German subsidiary. So the weaker dollar actually causes our reported revenue to increase even further. Now, if we go back to my matrix again, my another measure is COGS forecast. And then here again, similar to what we did with the revenues, I'm assigning the value of the COGS parameter to one of my variables. Then it uses that COGS PY actual as the base, which also looks at the cost of goods sold from a year earlier. Then in order to create that forecast, it applies the parameter value for COGS and also any FX adjustment for any non-US subsidiary. And again, we keep that filter here to make sure we apply those calculations only to the forecast period. Then the gross profit is simply the revenue forecast adjusted by that COGS. Again, we're using that positive number because COGS is negative. So effectively, we subtract costs from the revenue to calculate that gross profit. Then the gross profit percentage is simply a division of gross profit forecast by the revenue forecast. And then for our OPEX, we're following the same logic here. So this time we're taking that parameter from the OPEX change percentage as one of our variables. We still want to look at that FX adjustment. And then we look at the OPEX PY actual as our base, which again will be the actual OPEX from the same month a year earlier. And then we apply to that our OPEX adjustment and exchange rate adjustment for non-US subsidiaries, making sure that we're only showing that calculations for the forecast period. And with that, we can now operate our forecast operating profit, which is that gross profit adjusted for OPEX. And then we can calculate our operating profit margin, which is that operating profit forecast divided by revenue forecast. So going back to our parameter, you can now see that if we increase our COGS by, let's say, 20%, the COGS here change as well. Our profit decreases. If we change our OPEX by, let's say, 10%, that operating profit decreases further. Or if we manage to decrease the OPEX, our operating profit will actually improve. Now, in order to create that chart below, I've inserted line and cluster column chart from my visual gallery. I kept that year month column as my x-axis, and then as my column axis, I use that amount forecast measure. That measure simply combines that revenue, COGS, and OPEX forecast, but I'm able to split those columns in those separate components, so in the revenue, COGS, and OPEX, by placing that common category column from the map accounts table in my column legend. In addition to that, I inserted operating profit forecast measure as my line axis, and then as my second line, I'm using here that revenue 3-month moving average. And here I apply the similar logic that I applied to my dashboard page. So I look at the total revenue from the last 3 months, and then I divide it by the month count, which is 3, in order to get my 3-month average. Now you will notice that here I'm actually using that revenue actual plus forecast measure. So if any of the period from those last 3 months falls into the actual period, it also makes sure that it takes those actual revenue values into consideration. Finally, here you see that I'm using that cluster column chart to compare the annual actual numbers with the forecast numbers. So here I'm using that amount actual plus forecast measure. And this measure, by using that coalesce function, displays the actual amount for any dates that fall into the actual period, and then that forecast amount for any dates that fall into the forecast period. Which means if I put that year column from the calendar table as my legend. I can show the revenue, COGS, and OPEX for 2024. So for the actuals, and then for 2025, which is my forecast period. Then finally, I also added that small matrix here. So I'm using year column for my calendar table for my rows, then that amount actual plus forecast measure for my values. For my columns, I'm using the values for my common category column, which again come from the map accounts table. And then here, if I go to the format table, you see that I've also switched on the column subtotals and then named the subtotals labels as operating profit, which adds this revenue, COGS, and OPEX together, effectively creating my operating profit calculation. If we go back to my tutorial, you see here that I cover the forecast setup along with the measures. You can also find all the baseline and actuals measures in the previous steps. And then if we scroll down, you see that I've added the recap of our tutorial. And then at the end, you can preview the dashboard. So again, look at our actuals P&L, that variance analysis and the breakdown by client, the visuals or a dashboard page for further analysis, and finally the forecast page where you can test our assumptions and see their impact on the overall profit and loss.
I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to download the dashboard or want to learn more about data analytics, follow the links in the description of this video, or if you have any questions, leave a comment below. To get in touch with me directly, go to my website at www.challengejp.com. Thank you very much.